Joel eyed the car parked across his driveway, its silhouette shadowy and low against the dim streetlight. This wasn't the first time he'd noticed it, but something about it tonight prickled his instincts, setting off a chill that ran straight down his spine. It was late, almost midnight, the time when things were supposed to be quiet, settled, and secure. Yet here he was, fists clenched, watching the car idle, as if it had some claim to his space. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening, something he was about to find out in the worst possible way. As Joel walked closer, the suspicion brewing in his gut began to fester into something darker. His wife, Lisa's recent behavior had been gnawing at him. She was always on her phone, disappearing for hours, brushing off his questions with evasive replies. And here it was, that nagging hunch in the form of a black sedan parked right at his front door. He took a deep breath, feeling his pulse quicken as he approached his house, his eyes never leaving the car. The closer he got, the clearer it became that the person inside had no intention of facing him. Before he could reach the car door, the driver revved the engine, hesitated a second too long as Joel met his gaze, one of fear, guilt, maybe both, before peeling away into the night. Joel stood in the driveway, his hands clenched into fists as the car taillights disappeared down the street. That fleeting, guilt-ridden look the driver had given him was seared into his mind. It was a look he hadn't seen in a long time, one he never thought he'd see directed at him, especially from the person sitting beside his wife. As he took slow, deliberate steps toward his front door, the events of the past months replayed in his mind. Lisa, once the warm, devoted woman he'd shared 20 years with, had changed. The first signs were subtle, a new interest in her appearance, extra hours at the gym with her friend Maria, more nights out than he could keep up with. She'd shed old habits and took on this newfound confidence, almost like she was slipping into a new skin he barely recognized. He had admired her transformation at first, but then came the distance, the secrets, and finally, the unmistakable signs of betrayal that only now, in this moment, Joel knew he couldn't ignore. He approached the door, the dim porch light casting shadows across the hallway inside. Everything was quiet, almost too quiet, but his instincts told him that Lisa was waiting. She had to be. He braced himself as he opened the door, stepping into the darkened living room. And there she was, standing in the center of the room, looking at him with wide, nervous eyes, as if caught off guard by his silent entry. Lisa's face was pale, her expression a mix of defiance and shame. Her arms were folded tightly across her chest, a stance that once would have been defensive, yet now only betrayed her fear. She opened her mouth, as though searching for the right words to explain the car, to explain everything. But Joel was faster. "Who was in the car, Lisa?" he asked, his voice low but firm, each word heavy with restrained anger. He already knew, but he wanted to hear her say it. Her gaze darted toward the window, as if she were calculating an escape route, but she quickly settled back on him. "Joel, it's not what you think," she stammered, her voice cracking. "Not what I think." He let out a bitter laugh. "Do you even hear yourself? That man was parked in front of my house. He ran the moment he saw me. And you're telling me this isn't what I think it is?" She flinched, her face hardening. He didn't want to start any trouble. "Okay," she replied, her voice sharper, but she avoided his eyes. "He's just a friend." "A friend?" Joel's tone turned colder. "A friend you brought into our home." At that, her composure faltered. She glanced down, lips trembling as the truth hovered just beyond reach. Joel's patience had run dry. He took a step forward, towering over her, as he demanded, "Why did he run, Lisa? What kind of friend can't even look me in the eye?" She swallowed, visibly shaken, the bravado draining from her face. For a second, he saw a flicker of the woman he had once known, the woman who would never betray him, the woman who used to hold his hand in this very room, laughing and promising him forever. But that woman was long gone, and what remained was a stranger clutching at lies. "He was just here to talk," she muttered, barely audible. "I told him not to come, but he thought he could face you." "Face me!" Joel's voice boomed, his anger no longer containable. "He ran, Lisa, just like you're running now. Look at you, you can't even admit what's been going on." Lisa opened her mouth, but no words came. She just stood there, shrinking back under his accusing gaze. Joel felt the last threads of his patience snap. It was over. Whatever love, loyalty, or trust they'd built over the years had crumbled in this one moment, under the weight of her betrayal. With one last look, he took a deep breath and stepped back. Joel stood there, looking at Lisa with a mixture of anger, betrayal, and heartbreak. He could feel the rage rising inside him, pushing him to do something, anything to make sense of the whirlwind he'd been dragged into. But then he remembered the taunt that had been thrown his way earlier that day, the mocking words from a voice he now recognized as the man in that car, the lover. He said he'd confront me, Joel said, his voice a low growl as he paced around the room, trying to contain the fury coursing through him. Your friend was so bold over the phone, wasn't he? Talking about how he'd handle me, how he'd show me what a real man looked like. He turned to Lisa, his eyes hard and unyielding. But one look at me, and he couldn't even face what he's done. Or maybe he just couldn't face what you both have done. Lisa's face drained of color. She had tried to keep up the facade, to keep her composure, but now she looked trapped. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Finally, she forced herself to speak. Joel, it's not what you think. He was just upset. He didn't mean any of that. I didn't mean any of this. Didn't mean any of this. Joel's voice was barely a whisper, but the anger was unmistakable. He clenched his fists, feeling the weight of every painful word. Then tell me, Lisa, what did you mean by humiliating me in front of your friends? Or boasting about this cowardly man? Did you think I wouldn't find out? Tears pooled in her eyes as she struggled to find the words, but Joel wasn't done. You were so eager to flaunt this, to humiliate me, and now where is he? Joel's laughter was bitter, cutting through the silence. Some champion you chose. Look where he left you. Lisa's shoulders sagged, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to defend herself. But there was no defense for what she'd done, and she knew it. The fight had gone out of her, replaced by a dawning fear of what was about to happen. Finally, she managed, I'm sorry, Joel, I never wanted it to go this far. You didn't want it to go this far. His voice was incredulous, eyes piercing into hers with unmasked fury. But here we are. Because of your choices, Lisa, you shattered everything we built. She tried to take a step toward him, reaching out a trembling hand, but Joel pulled back. The distance between them felt like a chasm. He could see her remorse now, a flickering too little and too late. But even as she looked up at him, pleading silently, all he could feel was the growing emptiness inside. Tell me, Lisa, Joel demanded, his voice quiet but laced with ice. Was it worth it? The thrill, the secrecy, the so-called excitement? Was it worth destroying our family? She crumbled under his gaze, finally covering her face with her hands, the sobs she'd been holding back breaking free. Joel watched her cry, but he felt no urge to comfort her, no impulse to ease her pain. Instead, he felt only the raw weight of betrayal pressing down on him, anchoring him in place. After a long silence, Joel looked around the room, their photos on the wall. The worn couch where they'd spent countless evenings together. The shelves lined with mementos of a life that now felt like a lie. His home, his sanctuary, no longer felt like his. It felt tarnished, like everything he built had been tainted by her deceit. Finally, he turned back to Lisa, his voice steady, but exhausted. I can't do this, Lisa. I can't keep living a life built on lies. Her sobs stopped abruptly as she looked up, fear flashing in her eyes. Joel, please. We can work through this. I made a mistake, but don't throw everything away. But his mind was made up. The betrayal was a wound too deep to heal, and as much as he wished he could rewind time, he knew he couldn't undo what had been done. He'd seen the truth now, the ugly reality she'd tried to hide, and there was no going back. Without another word, he walked to the door, each step feeling heavier than the last. He opened it, pausing only once to look back at her. She was standing there, broken and pleading, but he felt nothing. Whatever they'd had was gone, shattered beyond repair. With that, he closed the door behind him and stepped into the night, ready to face whatever came next alone. As Joel walked into the cool night air, he felt a mix of relief and a deep ache that settled heavy in his chest. He had left Lisa there, alone in their home that now felt like a stranger's. The quiet street seemed surreal, each familiar feature of his neighborhood cast in a new light. He'd spent years building this life, investing in every little detail that had once symbolized security and happiness. Now it was like he was standing outside a house of cards that had collapsed, wondering if it was worth ever building anything again. He sat down on the front steps, trying to process the maelstrom inside him. The betrayal hurt, of course, but it was the humiliation, the very public way Lisa had flaunted her lover, that stung the most. She had invited this man into their lives, taunted him with the man's supposed superiority, only for the man to crumble under a single look. The irony was bitter and cutting. Joel clenched his fists, feeling a cold fury he'd never felt before. He looked down the street, and his eyes traced the path where the lover's car had disappeared, tires squealing as he'd sped off. Joel couldn't shake the memory of the man's cowardice, his pale, frightened face barely visible through the windshield before he'd fled. All those bravado-filled threats, The sneering taunts over the phone, empty words from a man who couldn't even hold his ground. A sick satisfaction welled up in him at the thought that the man had been too afraid to face him. He wasn't sure how long he sat there, his mind replaying each moment of the night, dissecting it piece by piece, examining every painful detail. He thought of the years he'd invested in this marriage, the countless sacrifices he'd made to ensure Lisa and the kids had everything they needed. He'd weathered hard times with her, stood by her side through her own battles, her insecurities, even through that grueling fight with cancer 7 years ago. He'd been her rock. He had thought that counted for something, that their bond was unbreakable. Now he realized that, somehow, that wasn't enough. Suddenly his phone buzzed, snapping him out of his trance. He pulled it from his pocket and saw a message from his old friend Mike. "Hey man, I know it's late, but you good? Heard from Jake that things were rough at home. Let me know if you want to talk." Joel stared at the message, feeling an overwhelming urge to talk, to just get everything off his chest. He hadn't reached out to anyone about what he'd been dealing with, partly out of shame, partly because he'd still been hoping it would all blow over. But that hope was gone, replaced by a hollow ache he didn't know how to fill. He typed a quick reply. "Not sure what there is to say, Mike. Everything's blown up." A moment later, his phone buzzed again. "I'm here, man. Whatever you need. You don't have to go through this alone." Joel let out a long breath. He didn't feel like talking about it, not yet. But it felt strangely comforting to know someone was there, that maybe, just maybe, there was still a flicker of support in his life that hadn't been tainted by betrayal. He typed back a simple thanks and pocketed his phone again. As he sat there in the quiet, staring up at the stars barely visible through the city lights, he felt something shift inside him. This wasn't the life he had wanted, but maybe this was the push he needed to finally reclaim some part of himself. He had lived so much of his life for others, for Lisa, for the kids, for the family they'd built. But now, for the first time, he wondered what it might be like to live for himself, to rebuild on his own terms. The thought was terrifying but also strangely freeing. Joel rose to his feet, feeling a weight lift slightly from his shoulders. He took one last look at their house, now reduced to a shell of broken promises, and turned his back on it. Joel walked away from the house, his footsteps crunching on the gravel as he made his way toward his car. The night was quiet, heavy with the finality of his decision. With each step, he felt the painful but liberating realization that the life he'd known was over. The love he had once shared with Lisa, built up over 2 decades of commitment, had been poisoned beyond repair. She had made her choice, and now he was making his. Sitting behind the wheel, Joel took a moment to steady his breathing. The ache of betrayal still cut deeply, but as he looked back at the house one last time, he realized he didn't feel regret. He had done everything he could, given her everything he had, and she had thrown it away. There was no turning back from the bitterness that had festered between them. He switched on the ignition, letting the low hum of the engine fill the silence. For a moment he just sat there, unsure where he would go. He didn't want to be at home, nor did he want to go to some empty hotel room that would only remind him of his solitude. Then he thought about his friend Mike's message, the way it had cut through his isolation like a lifeline. With a sense of purpose, Joel sent Mike a quick message. "Mind if I swing by? Might take you up on that talk after all." The response was immediate. "Absolutely. Come over, I'll put on some coffee." Joel drove, the night winding around him as he made his way through the familiar streets. A wave of memories washed over him as he passed landmarks from his life with Lisa, the grocery store where they'd spent Saturday mornings, the park where they'd taken the kids on weekends, the old diner where they'd celebrated anniversaries with pie and coffee. But tonight, these places no longer felt like they belonged to him. They were remnants of a life he was leaving behind, symbols of a love that had turned hollow and bitter. He pulled into Mike's driveway, his heart heavy but resolute. Mike met him at the door, his face lined with concern but without a trace of pity, for which Joel was grateful. The two men embraced in a quick, reassuring hug, and Mike led him inside. The warmth and familiarity of Mike's living room, with its worn leather couches and stacks of old magazines, felt like a sanctuary compared to the cold emptiness he had left behind. "Coffee or something stronger?" Mike asked, his voice calm and steady. Joel hesitated, then gave a slight nod. "Something stronger." Mike poured 2 glasses of bourbon and handed one to Joel. They sat in silence for a moment, the quiet stretching out comfortably between them. Joel finally broke the silence, his voice low and hoarse. "It's over, Mike. 20 years, and she just threw it all away." Mike nodded, letting Joel's words hang in the air before replying. "I'm sorry, man. I know how much you loved her. You didn't deserve this." Joel's jaw tightened. I keep asking myself where I went wrong, if there was something I missed, or if I could have been better somehow. But the truth is, it wasn't enough for her. I wasn't enough. Mike put a hand on Joel's shoulder, a solid, grounding presence in the midst of his turmoil. Don't do that to yourself, Joel. This isn't on you. She made her choices, and she'll have to live with them. But you have a chance to start over, to build something better for yourself. Joel stared into his glass, the amber liquid reflecting the dim light in the room. Starting over. The words tasted foreign, but also held a glimmer of possibility. Feels like I'm standing on the edge of a cliff. Yeah, Mike replied, leaning back. But think about it, everything that held you back, everything that limited you, it's behind you now. You can do whatever you want, go wherever you want. You don't have to keep living in the shadow of what you thought your life was supposed to be. Joel considered this, letting the idea settle into him. He had spent so long defining himself by his role as a husband, a father, a provider. But now he was free to rebuild, to reclaim the parts of himself he'd sacrificed over the years. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight in his chest ease just a little. It's terrifying, he admitted. But maybe you're right. Maybe it's time I finally start thinking about what I want. Mike raised his glass, a spark of encouragement in his eyes. To new beginnings, then. Joel clinked his glass against Mike's, feeling the warmth of friendship and support seep into him. He wasn't alone in this journey. He had friends who believed in him, who would be there to help him navigate the uncertainty ahead. As he took a sip, Joel felt the pain of betrayal begin to loosen its grip. There would be hard days, and the scars would remain, but for the first time he felt hope stirring. He didn't know where he was headed, but he knew he was done looking back. The road ahead might be uncharted, but it was his, and he was ready to take the first step forward.